single biggest wilderness area in Alaska, and a place that's been the center of controversy for many years. And it's a battle we're going to fight over and over again, because part of this largest wilderness area has a sort of special status where the law that created it contains a clause that says Congress can revoke the wilderness status of this 1002 area anytime they want to. So it's kind of a provisional wilderness, and we're going to have to fight for it over and over again. And if you've been listening to the news, the oil that feeds into the Alaska pipeline is starting to run out. And so this ugly issue is going to raise its head again, because we've got a pipeline, we've got to use it to get that oil out of the ground. So we're going to visit the refuge. I don't know. Make it a little darker in here.
You need more light?
I guess that's good enough. So we're going to go to the refuge, and we're going to talk about some of the controversy that surrounds it. Well, it's a pretty special place. The lighting and the starkness of the mountains, clarity of the water. I've never yet bothered to purify or filter water. We always just drink it right out of the stream. So it's a special place with a really unique atmosphere. And being an amateur artist, I take my sketchbook along and just revel in the scenery. Now, I've been leading backpacks in the refuge and other parts of the Brooks Range since 1988, and so I have lots of experience actually being on the ground and hiking in the mountains. But it also turns out that I did most of my career with the U.S. Geological Survey, and so I'm a professional geoscientist. I'm quite familiar with the technical aspects of the oil field, and I'm going to torch you with a little bit of background geology on the Prudhoe Bay oil deposit, so you have some idea of what the resource that might be there is and how it might contribute to the nation's energy needs. But first, let's just look at some of the magnificent country to get a feel for how big and how wild this place is. Just endless streams and endless views. Here I am sitting with my daughter on a ridge, just looking at this wide open country. And to give you an idea of how big the scale is, here we're looking down into the valley, and you probably can just barely make them out. But right over here, where that small stream comes into the valley, are a bunch of little dots. Those are our tents. That's our campsite. So you really get to feel pretty small when you stand up on these mountains and look on forever over what seems to be endless wilderness. This is a subject that always pains me. Here I am walking up some nameless side valley for a few hours all on my own on a evening after dinner, and it really hurts you when you're hiking there, when you see there are thousands of these valleys and you can't explore them all. You can maybe do one or two a day, but so much of that country you're never ever going to see. It's out there, and you wish you could take the time to do every one of those. And just camping out in that open space, 24-hour daylight, fabulous experience. Mountains just go on forever. This picture is Wilbur Mills, the guy who brought me in as an Alaska guide. He's now retired. So Wilbur homesteaded in Alaska in the 1960s and was a fountain of history and lore on Alaska. This is the Shinjack River, one of the premier wilderness rivers in the refuge, and an entire river system that's nothing but wilderness. And of course, the weather isn't always perfect. You're sometimes hiking in some pretty miserable conditions, but it all goes with Mother Nature. Okay, so where is the refuge? Now, here's a map of Alaska, and you can see there are three great mountain ranges. There's the Brooks Range in the north, and then the Alaska Range in the south, and then along the coast is the coastal range, or Chugach Range. So three major mountain ranges, and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is up against the border with Canada on the extreme eastern part of the Brooks Range, which is also the highest part. Now, it turns out that we think of northern Alaska as being pretty wild, but a lot of that coastal plain has already been developed. You've got the Prudhoe Bay oil field in the center, connected to the Haul Road, which used to So quite a bit of that northern part of Alaska actually has been developed. And so having this one large intact wilderness refuge area on the eastern side is really important, because that's really our last stronghold of pure wilderness. And down at the bottom is a picture of what the coastal plain looks like as you look up into the wilderness. Now here's the refuge itself, and it's broken up into three areas. There's a central part that is run as pure wilderness. No trails, no vehicles, entirely wilderness. Then you've got a southern fringe that's operated as a preserve, so the native people can take their snowmobiles in there and help live off the land. And then there's the 1002 area, which is the coastal plain on the north. And that's that area that has this peculiar escape clause attached to it, where Congress can, if they get enough votes, overturn the wilderness status and open that up to development. So that's the area that's the primary mode of contention. And then there's several scenic river corridors that are outlined in blue. And the biggest one is the Sheep Jack, which is a fabulous boat trip. Okay, the history of the refuge. 1959, Alaska gained statehood and was given a 100 million acre base for their taxes. In 1960, the Fish and Wildlife Service created the Wildlife Range, which is not really, does not give it real wilderness status, but sort of helps provide the impetus to manage the land. In 1966, there was a landmark decision where native protests suspended the oil leasing, which had already started to go on the basis that these native people knew they were going to get some land, but nobody knew whose land was which. And so it wasn't fair for the government to go out there and start leasing land that might be the native people's. And then shortly after, some of that leased land that was being explored hit a gusher. And so in 1967, the cat was out of the bag. There was a huge oil deposit up there. And so that wonderfully motivated everybody to resolve this land issue. And in 1971, we had the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which finally decided who got what land. And then in 1979, we had to deal with what land was going to be parks, and so that finally passed Congress, and we had the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act passed to decide which land was going to be set aside as parkland. And President Carter officially made the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge instead of range, and had it managed as a national park, and gave it the wilderness status. The only problem was the 1002 area clause was stuck in there, so it's a wilderness area, but it's got part that can be taken out wilderness at any time. So that's the background. One of the main issues is that there are two huge 200 to 400,000 animal caribou herds in Alaska. One in the west called the western herd, and one in the east called the porcupine herd, which winters in Canada at the headwaters of the Porcupine River, and then moves into Alaska and out onto the coastal plain in the summer. And you can see that 1002 area is the critical calving grounds for those caribou. And what's happening is the mosquitoes are driving north in a frenzy, and so they have to go out on the coastal plain where they can be cooled by the breezes off the pack ice, keep the mosquitoes at bay while they drop their calves. Well, let's do a little bit of geological background. Primarily because I'm a geologist, and it is interesting to explain something about how the world got there. Well, where did Alaska come from? If you see that little blue piece of land called ACT, that's the Alaska coastal terrain. And what happened was that broke away from the north of Canada and then rotated under the pressures of continental drift, opening up this huge basin that will become the Arctic Ocean. So the Canadian basin opens up as Alaska rotates away, and if you see the little red star, that's the hot spot that's now under Iceland, and that was acting like a blowtorch to help break up the continent. So that's the scenario that's going on. And if you investigate the oil field, you see that at one time this piece of land that's the North Slope of Alaska was the edge of the Canadian continent and started to receive these gentle sediments off mainland Canada. And then as the huge continent started breaking up, more and more mud, limestone was deposited in tropical waters, and because the waters are rich and tropical, they're full of organic matter, and stuff that's going to be developed in oil is settling into the sediments. Well, the plot thickens when that piece of Alaska runs into mountain rock drains that are being pushed into Alaska on the other side, and all of a sudden the transport turns around, comes from the other direction, and piles up and creates a big basin full of mud. And as it sinks, it gets hotter, and pressure starts to act, and abundant amounts of hydrocarbons start to ooze out of it and move uphill and get trapped under the edge of the coastal plain. And one of my themes of my backpacking trips has been in search of the Pebble Shale, because there's an unusual geologic formation that marks the time when sediments stop coming from Canada and start coming from interior Alaska. And that's a shale, which is a fossil mud, indicative of really quiet, still waters. But in that shale are these pebbles about the size of golf balls, and it's very hard to figure how they got there. So there are a couple of theories. One is that storms every now and then blew in some pieces of rock. Maybe there was, even though the world was much warmer, maybe there were streams that were bringing ice down from their headwaters, and the ice had rocks stuck in them, so when they melted, the rocks would drop into the water. Or maybe they were caught in the roots of seaweeds that were ripped up by storms and drifting about. The most exciting and exotic one is the recognition that dinosaurs were the ancestors of birds, and maybe some of these dinosaurs had stones that they swallowed from their gizzards to grind up whatever they were eating. So maybe those pebbles are gizzard stones from dinosaurs. So it's an interesting thing to think about, and we've tried hard on lots of trips to find exactly where in this black shale sequence you see around that mountain sheet the pebble shale horizon actually is. But the end product of this is that the edge of the continent becomes this giant oil trap that no one even knew was there. The reason the state of Alaska gets the Prudhoe Bay oil field is just because when they were lining up land, they realized we're going to have to survey the north coast of Alaska to get the high tide line, so we can figure out what's onshore and what's offshore. And the state said, well, since we own the shelf, we'll take the onshore part too, and we own it all, and we don't have to come up with the line. That was the only rationale for the state of Alaska taking for their part of the land the North Slope, which turned out to be a huge oil reservoir, which turns out to be the reason why everybody in Alaska gets $2,000 a year just for existing from their fund. In the oil field parlance, they consider looking for oil fields to be a hunting project, and so when you find a field like this, you shot an elephant. So this is one of the world's few elephants in the petroleum world. An interesting fact that people don't recognize is that when you talk about the 1002 area, the thought is, well, that's part of the Prudhoe Bay oil field. It ought to be a winner. Well, the problem is that the deposits that hold the oil in Prudhoe Bay have actually been uplifted above the surface. And so the only part that's left is a tiny little island piece called Bathtub Ridge. So the oil field at Prudhoe Bay does not exist in the 1002 area. There may be oil in other formations, but the big one, the elephant, is probably not there. There may be lots of deer and woodchucks, but no elephant. It turns out that one of my colleagues at the USGS was actually charged with making a resource assessment during one of these attempts to open up the area to find out exactly how much oil there is there. And of course, the problem is the wilderness area, there's not much data. So he took the very limited amount of data that's there, and by way of comparison, the Prudhoe Bay was estimated to have about 16 billion barrels of oil recoverable. And today we produce 12 billion, so that oil field is getting near the end of its life. The USGS estimate, based on limited data, was there's at least 3 billion barrels, and at most 15 billion. And based on very limited data, high amount of uncertainty, and probably much more likely to be towards the low end than the high end. But that's the resource base we're dealing with. There's likely to be some oil there, but might be quite a bit, but we don't know for certain. So what's the controversy? It all boils down to three arguments on either side. For developing the field, the first argument is it's a valuable resource. And it's un-American to have something that's valuable and just leave it there. Okay? Second is, you cite the need for energy independence. It would be nice to leave the area intact, but we need that energy to be independent, and so we have to use it. And then the third argument is, you know, hey, wait a minute, we're just putting in some roads and pipelines. You know, we're not really tearing the place up. And if you do the calculation, quite a bit less than 10% of the land would actually be physically affected. The argument against development is that the 1002 area is the last really wild tract of coast left, intact and untouched. Then you note that it's critical cattle ground for the caribou, which are the livelihood for a lot of the native people, and we have treaties with the Canadians managing that herd, so it's a pretty big deal. And then the third argument is that even though less than 10% of the land would be affected, it's going to have a massive footprint. There's going to be a whole network of roads and pipelines. So it's not like we're not disturbing the land. There's going to be almost nowhere where you're not going to be able to see something in the distance that is not part of the wilderness. So that in a nutshell is what we're talking about. Now we're just going to go and see what it's like to backpack and experience this wonderful piece of land that's potentially threatened. Well, how do you get there? You saw my map, there's really just two native villages anywhere near within flying distance. And you have to take a commuter flight from Fairbanks to one of these outlying villages, and then have contracted with a bush pilot who will meet you there, and then take you in a small plane. They usually carry 3 passengers at a time, and land on the tundra. So you start out in these native villages. Here's Arctic Village, the closest one. The Gwich'in people live there, and Athabascan native people, and they still live primarily by subsistence. When you say village in Alaska, this is what you're looking at. You're not seeing a little main street like Tombstone, Arizona. You see a bunch of cottages spread out over quite some distance in the woods, with a couple of muddy roads that connect. And next time you complain about gas prices, you go to these little towns, gas is now $8 a gallon. So you get some, not that there's anywhere to drive. So you get in the plane with a bush pilot, and you fly over endless mountains. And this is one of the greatest thrills on the whole adventure. You usually fly for an hour and a quarter, and you see no sign that humanity exists. It's just endless mountains. There's lots of trails, but they're all animal trails. And you just fly for over an hour over scenery that looks like that. And then you land on the tundra. And it's a bit daunting at first when you realize that guy's just going to land on the ground. If he hasn't been there in a while, he may go down and sort of touch it with the wheels a bit, and then just see what it feels like. And he'll drop some chaff or something out of the plane to see which way the wind's blowing. But you land on that tundra, and then you take your stuff out. There's usually it's a Cessna 206 that we fly, and you have to take all your stuff out and unpack and get organized, begin the trip. Now you land down on the coastal plain into the mountains behind you, and what I invariably do is climb the mountains and take a look over the coastal plain and see what the scenery looks like. So that's the Jago River, one of the main drainages to the north. And we have to say a word about mosquitoes. You know, Alaska's famous for mosquitoes, but the North Slope is interesting because you get almost an entire month from the last week in June, May, until towards the end of June, that's mosquito-free. It's the sunniest time of the year, the best weather in Alaska, and the mosquitoes really don't come out until about the 20th of June. So if you want to backpack the refuge, you want to go up. And typically you make a 2-week trip, so you want to be up the first week of June and out by the start of the third. But occasionally I've been dumb enough to go there during the height of the mosquito season, and that's what you get. And when you get there, this would be maybe the 3rd or 4th of June, this is what the countryside will look like. I mean, it's still virtually in the grips of winter. Snow's at least partially gone. Everything looks sort of brown and dull. And within 1 week, it just explodes. Brown because absolutely covered with wildflowers. You may wake up with 6 inches of wet snow in your tent the next morning, but largely solar collectors, so they follow the sun. And it's a 360-degree turn. So they follow the sun and solar collectors, so they're trying to warm up the bees that pollinate. Lots of Arctic blue pine. It can look like a Texas bluebonnet field at times. Really vibrant. Purple mountain saxifrage is one of the earliest flowers of the year. It's really spectacular, especially when you climb a mountain and see it blooming in bare rock right next to a glacier. Prostrate forget-me-not, another really spectacular flower. It's only a half an inch tall, or really colorful. Lapland rosebud is actually a rhododendron, and it covers great swaths of the tundra. And it looks just like one of the rhododendrons you plant around your foundation, except it grows real low to the ground. Another interesting northern flower is called bearflower boykinia. And a lot of these flowers, well, it's kind of an asparagus for bears. So if they can find the flower spike and it's still in bud, they'll eat it like it's asparagus. They really love that stuff. But that's the good news. The bad news is a lot of that tundra looks really smooth, but it's actually called tussock tundra. And this is the ecosystem after which it's named, the shrub birch tundra. And what you have are these humps of grass or sedge that are, we call them Arctic palm trees. If you try to stand on them, they'll fall off. So you have to step between them, and you never know whether you're going into your ankle or your hip. And if you're trying to have a 50-pound pack on your back, it's really miserable. So we spent endless hours scanning the landscape, trying to find ways around these tussock fields because they're really difficult to walk on. And in part because the tussock fields are such a bad deal, we spend a lot of time following rivers. So you expect to have your feet wet and walk along the river gravels, and then the river keeps moving back and forth, and you have to keep crossing it. But it's a lot easier than walking on tussocks. And one of the reasons is most of these rivers are braided. We're in the Arctic desert, and so rivers are choked with gravel just like they are in the desert. And the desert is not water, and the Arctic is too much gravel. So either way, you get the same thing. So you spend a lot of time wading these things, but it's so much easier than walking over those tussocks. And then there are patches of willows that impinge on these streams. And the biggest issue there is if you can't see into them, you want to whisper or say something because there might be a grizzly sitting in there. Another thing that's unique to the Arctic is a formation called off ice. And what's happening here is that it gets so cold in the winter that the whole river freezes right to its bottom. And then if you've got spring discharge coming into that river, it's got nowhere to go. So it finds a way to, under pressure, to make itself get through that ice and go out on the surface. And so all winter long, you're laying down these additional layers of ice on top of where the river flows. Then in the spring, the river breaks its way through that ice, and you're left with these massive plateaus of layered ice. And in theory, they're great walking. The problem is getting up on them. You can see this one's about 6 feet high. You can see that in the picture. So here we are looking at this thing and figuring out, well, how are we going to get up on there? And then when you finally do get up there, then you have problems if you have these canyons that are cut by side streams that you have to jump across. So it's not as easy as it looks. Now the other aspect of this kind of wilderness country is that the signs of wildlife are everywhere. This country is just, it's not tracked as wilderness, it's all tracked up, but none of the tracks are human. So you're constantly seeing signs of caribou and wolf kills and things like that. And if you time it right, you can beat caribou migration. Now you see in some of these pictures, like Never Cry Wolf, that you see this sea of caribou that extends to the north. And that's not what the migration looks like. It's sort of like this endless river of caribou that keeps braiding by in groups of 100, 200, 300. So that's about the height of migration, but they're just swinging by like that the whole time. And you see these little groups, they that's what the migration looks like. It's not huge, it's only a few hundred at a time, but they sure are wonderful to see. And they come in real handy because when you get on some of these tricky, unstable slopes, they form nice little highways for you to follow. Now, you can't see it in this picture, but we have a woman with us who was really scared of heights, and she took a little encouragement to get across this. And I one client said, "Well, look, if the caribou can make it, we can make it." And we come around the corner, and there's a dead caribou. But for the most part, they do make it. Now, one of the nice aspects of the treeless terrain is there's lots of birds nesting, and all of them nest around the ground. So you get to see these wonderful, interesting bird nests. The one on the left there is the American golden plover, which always lays 4 eggs, and they're always ranged with perfect geometry in the square with the points towards the center. Up on the right is the Lapland longspur, kind of big sparrow, the Arctic. And then the lower right is my favorite, that's a red pole. And it's kind of like an Arctic jewel box. They have this nice little braided nest, and they always line it with ptarmigan feathers. So it has a white lining, and then there are these sort of pale blue speckled eggs that are in the bottom of the nest. So they're really wonderful to see, and they always seem to be there. Now, the reason they're white ptarmigan feathers are that male ptarmigans are kind of sacrificial victims. They stay white from the winter right into the early summer. And they're sort of the sacrificial victims, so that when Mrs. Ptarmigan is sitting on her eggs, the predators will key in on the male. And you can see them from a mile away. And the chief predator for ptarmigan is a thing called a jager. There's 3 different kinds. There's a long tail, a short tail, and a long tail. And these are predatory birds about the size of a hawk, a red-tailed hawk, that spend most of their life out over the ocean and eating seabirds. But they have to come on land to nest. So they come into Alaska and nest, and you see hundreds of these little piles of white feathers where they eat the male ptarmigans. And in addition, you have another one of my favorite Alaska flowers, the glacier even foreground, for additional color. Now you can see that Mrs. Ptarmigan is a lot harder to see. See, it's really hard to see her. Anybody pick her out? She's right smack in the middle. But with the close-up, you can see her a little better.
Wow.
So, for example, on this latest trip that I did to the Western Coast Range in June, we saw hundreds of male ptarmigan, and we didn't see a single female. Because you have to practically step on them to make them flush, and you just can't see them. But the real center of the scenery are the mountains. It's absolutely fabulous to see these wild and rugged mountains. There I am. This is 1988 in my very first trip